Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Clive Brady from current chairman of the BWA. So it's a quick introduction from me and a quick welcome from me for joining us today. Gary Lampon will be the speaker today from HMRC and taking us through, obviously, a very important matter and subject around and on alcohol duty fraud, which continues to exist. I think that's the best thing to say. And from our perspective as the BWA, we do talk to our members about due diligence and the significance and importance of due diligence, and that should be a culture within your business. I think from the BWA's perspective, what we wanted to do today, and obviously invited Gary to present today, is to give you visibility of what duty fraud looks like, and that has mutated, I think, and as Gary will identify, since the EU exit, it has changed. But more importantly, it does continue to exist, and it exists now in a slightly different form. But we really wanted to give you visibility, so it's important that when you do your due diligence, you can identify and relate to what this does look like. So without further ado, I think in terms of housekeeping, we're gonna keep everybody muted. Please raise your hands, or not so much raise your hands, but pose the question, through the chat, and then we'll deal with that in a sweep up at the end, because we do have a pre-lodged question that we want Gary obviously to address. But any questions, either put them on chat, or we'll have an open session at the end around questions. So again, welcome to everybody. Thanks for your attendance, and I'll pass across to Gary. Gary, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Just to give a little bit of background on myself, my name's Gary Lampon. I've been with HMRC for quite a long time, 39 years this year. Most recently, I've been doing a lot of work going out and talking to businesses about fraud risks, not just alcohol fraud risks, a variety of fraud risks. My background is in criminal investigation, and as a result of that work, I think I'm kind of well placed to kind of talk about some of the things that we see and answer some of the questions that you have around alcohol fraud. It's a constantly changing and adapting kind of area. It doesn't stay still, and I've got some presentation material today which hopefully is going to help explain the kinds of problems that we're seeing now and the kind of things that we'd ask you to look out for when you're doing your business. I'm going to share a presentation. Sure. Present that. Graham, I wouldn't mind just confirming you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, okay. If at any point there's some animations in here, so if at any point the animations aren't running freely, or you've got a question about any of the issues, I'm happy to take those as we go along. We'd only have an hour today. I'm hoping that this is about 30 to 35 minutes in terms of presentation, so there will be some chance for a conversation at the end and to answer some questions. But if anything comes up, I can't see those hands up and I can't see the questions, but hopefully Graham and others are going to keep me straight and let me know if anybody needs some more information. Okay, so go straight into this. I'm ready to present. Okay, so brief introduction. So HMRC responsible for a really wide range of taxes, duties, benefits, and everything that we do is potentially vulnerable to fraud. It's all about money. Saying all of that, the vast majority of people pay the right amount of tax. They pay it at the right time, and we don't have a problem with that. A small minority will cheat, and a very small minority will set out to steal taxes which are due to HMRC. And principally, that's the group that we're talking about today. That's the organised criminal kind of end of the spectrum, people that have a kind of commercial interest in alcohol fraud. So we'll be talking about alcohol supply chains, and that's where the trade in alcohol is exploited to steal tax. Now, what I'm doing here is giving a general presentation around fraud risks. Some of this may or may not be specifically relevant to you and your business, but hopefully it gives the bigger picture kind of piece to help understand, for you to understand individually where your business may fit into some of these supply chains. We're going to look at the organised crime threats and how we think about organised criminality. We're going to look at alcohol fraud methods. We're going to look at some of the due diligence controls and the kind of indicators that potentially look out for. We're also going to look at some of those behavioural indicators as I mentioned, but also consider potential opportunities to tackle supply chain risks in the future. Not a formal consultation, but some of the things that we think about and I'll ask you to think about, things that you may do or see in your business that could help us tackle and control this issue better going forward. Okay, I do apologise, I'm having a slight kind of issue with a presentation. Okay, so what do we think? How do we think about organised crime? We think about organised crime as a pyramid. At the very top of that pyramid, we've got some high impact criminals. So these are a small number of individuals, a handful of people around the world who invest in fraud. And it's not just alcohol fraud, but where there's an opportunity to make money, they will invest, you know, six-figure sums and more in trying to commit fraud. In order to do that, they need criminal groups around them. So that may be one group or multiple groups that will work together to help steal money. Where we've got a tax risk or we've got an interface with a legitimate business, those groups will need enablers and facilitators to support them, to get them bank accounts, to get them kind of registered businesses, and to help them move their proceeds around. In alcohol fraud in particular, we need businesses. So businesses that will interface with producers, that will buy and sell alcohol in supply chains. And we're terming that where there's a high risk. We're talking about high risk businesses operating in high risk sectors. And obviously alcohol in the UK, lots of duty, lots of VAT and lots of opportunities to steal those taxes. So it's a high risk sector. So what do we need to do to address the risks? Well, first of all, we need to get our legislation and our processes right to make sure it's easy to pay the right amount of tax and that we control the risks where we identify them. We do risk-based compliance work, so looking to see what businesses are doing, what risks are out there, and controlling those on a kind of a routine basis. We also do targeted education, the kind of thing that I'm doing today, talking to businesses, to customers about the kind of risks that we see. And hopefully the more that we shine a light on the problem, the easier it is to identify. Where we need to do more, we might look at specific supply chains or specific businesses in supply chains to understand exactly what they're doing and how alcohol is flowing through those businesses. If we see a problem or we see a fraud, then we'll look to recover the money. And ultimately, we've got options such as criminal prosecution, where we need to tackle a really serious risk or an organised criminal group. However, all of that at the top end, the criminal prosecution work, the financial recovery, that's pretty short term. You know, there's a lot of people involved in alcohol fraud. We can have a dramatic, significant impact, but it tends to be fairly short term. In order to address the problem long term, we need to get that legislation right. We need to get our risk-based compliance working, and we need to talk to businesses more about the kinds of problems that we're seeing. That has the long-term impact, and it's something that we really need to make sure happens. So that's our approach to criminality. So what about organised fraud or alcohol fraud? It's the theft of excise duty and VAT, as I've mentioned. Current tax gap is around £600 million, and that's the difference between what the Exchequer is expecting in terms of revenue and what we're receiving. It's a pretty blunt instrument. It's one of those areas where it's really helpful in understanding if things are moving in the right direction, but the number itself is you know, there's quite a margin in terms of the error around that. So potentially could be double, potentially could be half. it's a really difficult figure for us to kind of nail down, but it is really helpful in terms of understanding whether, as I say, we're moving in the right direction. Over the years, that number has been much higher, well over £1 billion in recent times, and it's something that I think we can all say, you know, we're moving in the right direction in a general sense, if not specifically around certain brands or certain individual issues that we've got within the sector. Within that kind of number, around 95% of the losses are attributed to organised crime. So this is why we're focusing on that particular group in this presentation. The main fraud types that we see are diversion fraud and smuggling. I've got some examples of diversion fraud. I think it's worth focusing on those. But all of that relies on international cross-border movements. So a lot of cross-border activity, a lot of movement of alcohol, and that's where the risk kind of manifests. Alcohol fraud, constantly evolving. You know, the threat displaces between different commodities, different brands, different markets, and different fraud types. If you've seen my presentations or presentations from HMRC in the past, they may be different to this one. You know, what we try and present is the most up-to-date picture, but it is a constantly changing threat, and that picture does change over time. One of the things that we're seeing, and it is a particular issue for us at the moment, are what we're terming transnational entities. So these are businesses that operate in multiple different jurisdictions. They might be registered in one country, they might be operating a warehouse in a different country, they might be buying product from a third country and selling it to a fourth country. And the different kind of jurisdiction control requirements and the kind of ownership of that business in terms of the controls around it, it's a really difficult area, and it presents particular challenges, particularly if all of that activity is offshore. We do have a strategy to tackle alcohol fraud. It's quite a long-standing strategy. Lots of different issues with that: simplification, digitisation of the process, some elements around additional controls. But one of the key elements here is sharing information and, as I say, trying to shine a light on the problem to improve supply chain controls and ultimately prevent tax losses. So, getting specifically into alcohol fraud, lots of different methods. But there are two main phases. The first is a positioning phase, which goods come out of the legitimate market and they're placed, usually in duty suspension, usually overseas, followed by a dissipation phase. And this is where those goods are then drawn out into low duty markets before smuggling and then distribution into the UK illicit market. Now, that's a very simple kind of summary. It's much more complicated than that, but those two phases are key. And we see different businesses operating in different kind of phases of activity. Obviously, there are genuine reasons that alcohol moves across borders, but there's always a risk that some of that is being positioned to facilitate fraud. Consolidation of popular UK brands, popular overseas brands in excise warehouses on the continent has been a feature of most of the frauds that we see for a number of years. Stockpiling of that product and the ability then to release that into the market, usually as kind of mixed loads and mixed branded loads that go out, and that they're then ready when they come into the UK and they move into the illicit market. They're ready for distribution into retail. We also see in our data a lot of circulation. So some of these mixed brands of beer and wine in particular, moving between Europe and the Republic of Ireland. Okay, and that's kind of a circular set of data. So you can see the product moving into Ireland and out again. It doesn't actually enter the Irish market. It just enters a few warehouses and then comes back out again. And that's a driver for some of these frauds. And I've got a couple of slides, hopefully, that help explain that a little bit more later. Okay, so alcohol fraud example. Start with a producer. This is a supply chain example. So this is the kind of end-to-end process of how the fraud happens. And that producer, doesn't matter if it's UK or overseas, but they've got a brand, an international brand that the criminals are interested in. And they're interested in brands that they can place into the market, that they can infiltrate kind of onto the shelf next to a genuine product, a genuine duty paid product. Looks exactly the same, tastes exactly the same. One's got duty on it and one hasn't. So they're looking for those brands, and that's their preferred products. Sometimes they might focus on particularly stronger brands, for example, stronger beer, or particular commodities where they know there's a good market for it. But it has to be something that they're able to kind of move and sell on the retail consumptive market. So that producer will supply into a warehouse, and you know, I'm giving a kind of a generic example here. This is based on multiple kind of real examples that we see, but it moves into a warehouse, into a tier 1 distributor, and that can often be one of these transnational entities. So one of these businesses that operates in multiple jurisdictions. That product then may move to a different warehouse in a different country, and that's extending the supply chain, moving it between countries, kind of losing its identity. We then can see this happen 2, 3, 4, 5 more times, moving between different countries, different warehouses and different owners. And we end up with a very complicated supply chain. It makes it difficult to trace, loses its identity. And of course, this is the point where what happens is it's drawn out into those low duty markets, often to a business which is either missing or is hijacked. And the hijacked identities of genuine businesses are used you know, to draw product out. The businesses themselves have no idea what's happening. They're just having their details used as cover for genuine movements. Once that product's out in the low duty market, then it's available to be moved into the illicit market, and that's where we see this dissipation. I've chosen specifically not to cover, you know, not to say the UK illicit market. This isn't just a UK problem. This is a problem where we've got low duty markets and high duty markets close to each other. So it's not just the UK, but the UK does particularly suffer. So that's a supply chain example. Apologies, now we're going to look at specific types of diversion. And for the UK warehouse keepers, outward diversion is a particular risk, and it's something that we're seeing reasonably frequently at the moment, so something to bear in mind. And this is where we've got a producer, generally due to suspended product, supplying a distributor in a UK warehouse. Now, those distributors could be one of our transnational entities, you know, or another business, will generally sell the product on. And so they're extending the supply chain, moving it to a second tier distributor, sometimes moving it between warehouses as well. So in this example, it's within the same warehouse, but it could move between warehouses in the UK. We then have an export declared, product moves for export, leaves the warehouse, and this is where things start to go wrong. So the destination, overseas, French warehouse, third distributor in the chain, another warehouse. But two things happen. The vehicle moves, and it could be either empty or it could have a cover load in it. The product itself stays in the UK and then moves into the illicit market. So we do see this. We do see empty loads. We do see cover loads of product. And we do see lorries that simply don't move at all. We don't see the outward movement. However, we do see generally the supply chain being closed, and the distributor or the warehouse overseas is expecting a load to arrive, and actually what is happening is that there's already low duty product pre-positioned overseas, exactly the same goods, and they drive into that warehouse. So it closes the movement. Everything looks like it's been done properly, but actually that product has not crossed any borders, and what we've got is different product, albeit identical, driving back into that warehouse. The benefit in this particular case is the difference between the tax and the duty in the two markets. So for example, if this was wine, obviously substantial duty on wine in the UK, very little duty on wine in France. You've got a real benefit here, and the additional benefit is, of course, is that nothing has crossed a border, so the opportunity for HMRC to intercept it, or border force to intercept it at the border, is reduced. So that's one of the particular issues that we've got, and something to look out for. We've also got something called transit diversion. We refer to it as transit diversion. This isn't necessarily something that you'll see directly, although possibly indirectly, if your warehouse is being used as a kind of either a holding point or a moving point for some of this product. We start with a producer, due to suspended product again, and in this particular example it moves to a warehouse in France. It has to be an overseas based warehouse. It isn't a UK based warehouse, but it could have come through a supply chain which came through a UK warehouse, and the product then ends up overseas. We then see a movement, in this particular example, a movement from France to Ireland. So the products have gone on a ferry, moved into Ireland in a second warehouse. We then have a transit declaration. So the product has moved into Ireland, it's moving back out of Ireland again, destined back for Europe, and a transit movement is declared. This is where things start to go wrong. So the product moves from Ireland, crosses into one of our West Coast ports, gets into the UK, destined in this example for another distributor based in the Netherlands. Lorry moves or doesn't move, we don't find the export movement or the outward movement, and the product is dropped off en route through the UK and enters the UK illicit market. Once again, the warehouse in the Netherlands is expecting an arrival. Some low duty product is put into warehouse to cover and close that movement. Benefit again is actually the same as with outward diversion, is the tax and duty difference. Difference in this particular case, we can see fraud in both directions. So the fraud could be a movement from Europe to Ireland through the UK, or from Ireland to Europe outwards through the UK. And I've got some slides, hopefully, which will clarify some of that for you. Okay, so I mentioned these various different types. We talked about smuggling, we talked about different sorts of diversion fraud. We've got alcohol fraud involving the United Kingdom and alcohol fraud involving Republic of Ireland. And those two things are prevalent at the moment. And I've got two slides here. One it's product that either starts or finishes in the UK, and another which starts specifically in Ireland. So with this example, we've got alcohol dispatched from the UK. That's going out, but actually it's diverted on its outbound leg and enters the UK illicit market. That's outward diversion. We've then got smuggling, so we've got product coming directly into the UK from the continent. And then we've got alcohol dispatched from France to Ireland, which travels across the UK road network. And we've got transit diversion, with that, some of that product ended up in the UK illicit market. And for that to work, we see reciprocal movements coming out of Ireland. So we see this circulation of product, even though some of that product may not be circulating. And then we see the movements closed as those duplicate loads enter back into the warehouse. So that's the UK kind of focused alcohol fraud. The example with the Republic of Ireland starts with dispatches directly from France or the continent into Ireland. So once it arrives in Ireland, it could be smuggled up through the north, through the Northern Ireland border, through the West Coast ports into the UK illicit market. Obviously, Northern Ireland has its own issues with smuggled product as well. And then we get alcohol dispatched from Ireland back into the continent. And obviously, we've got transit diversion risks as that product travels through the UK again. So you can see that's a kind of two-way traffic. And we see that product once again circulating around. In order to close those movements, low duty products entering those warehouses, and everything appears to be working fine. Okay, so what are the risk indicators? That's what's happening. What are the things to look out for? Well, due to suspended alcohol in transit, and specifically the transit movements involving Ireland, they're the ones that are a risk at the moment. False export declarations, well, genuine export declarations, but the vehicles don't travel or they travel empty, and that's a significant fraud risk for us. Those transnational entities that I mentioned, when they're trading involved in multiple jurisdictions, lengthy supply chains. Those non-commercial or circular movement patterns, and they just add cost but don't add any real value. They're designed really to facilitate fraud. There's no other purpose for them. Often destination markets, obscure, poorly defined. There's no retail end user in these supply chains, just more intermediaries. And we often see subcontract logistics, particularly for those cross-border movements. And this is where the actual activity happens, where the driver takes that product or leaves that product in a place where it's going to be diverted. Sometimes we get multiple seizures, lots of tax losses, and where we've got that, you can see that those goods are destined for the UK market. There's also quite useful international movement data that helps us try and understand the types of brands, the types of commodities that are moving around in those kind of circular movement patterns that allows us to focus on some of those particular brands. We try to do what we call track and trace work. We try and work with some of the larger producers to try and understand if we find a pallet label, where was that product produced, who was it supplied to, what market was it destined for. But we're seeing pallet labels either defaced or removed, and that's frustrating our track and trace work, and also, you know, enables those goods to kind of completely lose their identity. And then when we do look at some of these supply chains, when we do get into the business of kind of monitoring work, you know, what we're finding is a lot of the responses, the original kind of due diligence requirements, the stories that were told, the business models that were proposed around some of this activity, it really doesn't reflect what's actually happening in reality, and it jeopardizes that supply chain integrity. Okay, so what are the insights? What can we draw out of all of this? Well, generally, alcohol fraud is a significant and it's still ongoing risk for the UK. It hasn't been solved by EU exits. It's happening now. We've got large-scale cross-border movements, and that provides cover for alcohol fraud. And we've got outbound and transit movements, which are real opportunities to divert alcohol to the UK illicit market, as well as smuggling. I mean, smuggling has always been there and will continue to be there. But outbound and transit movements also provide cover for fraud. In terms of the specifics, well, we're seeing mixed brand loads. That's a key indicator for us. You know, those mixed brand loads are easier to divert, easier to put into the retail market. You know, retailers, if you're involved in this kind of illicit activity, you don't want a full pallet of a single brand. You want multiple brands which you can draw into your kind of retail environment. So we see mixed brand loads. We're seeing high strength beers, often Polish or Dutch brands. That's not the entirety of it. There's lots of UK and other kind of beer and wine involved. But high strength beer is a particular area at the moment. Generic or entry level wine brands. Difficult to be specific about the types of wine that we're talking about here, but you know, it's the ones that are 2 for a tenner, 3 for £12. Those kind of generic entry level wine brands are a key area. As mentioned previously, pallet labels being removed or defaced. This is something that you may see. You may identify that, you know, they're a product which appears to be genuine product, but actually there's nothing to tell you where it came from or who produced it. Those circular international movements, and this is something that you may see. Often these supply chains are lengthy, they're extended. You won't see all of the chain. But if you've got goods, say, for example, somebody's exporting goods which have previously been imported, so they were produced overseas, they've come into the UK, and now they're being exported again. Clearly, that's an issue. As you've got to question what the value in doing that, you know, what the actual purpose of doing that is. So, export of goods previously imported, or vice versa, are potentially areas to question. Intermediaries supplying other intermediaries. You've seen some of those extended supply chains. This is where it's happening multiple times. You know, there is a trade in alcohol. Not every intermediary is a problem, but it's where we've got multiple different intermediaries operating in the same chain, extending that chain, complicating that chain. That's where we tend to see the problems. And also, I mentioned subcontract haulage, particularly of those cross-border movements. You know, the goods should be exported. If they're not being exported, then the haulage element of that may be responsible or may be involved in the fraud. Okay, so we've talked about various risks. One of the areas that's often spoken about when we talk about alcohol fraud, or we talk about the kind of circular movements, the international cross-border movements of product, is around the grey market. Okay, it's often said, well, we're grey market traders, we're buying product, this is all genuine. There is a grey market, there is a genuine grey market, but there are some unintended consequences, and I think it's worth reflecting on a few of those. So in general, it's a market which provides alternatives to traditional distribution brands, particularly for branded goods. Traders operating in that area will take advantage of price variations between different markets, and they'll outcompete the authorised dealers. There are obviously benefits to it, wider product availability and competitive pricing, but the authorised channels, in terms of the brand, help maintain the brand value, and they protect consumers from unscrupulous behaviour. In this area, trading is opportunistic. You know, if there's an opportunity, somebody will grab it. They're motivated by the profit. It's poorly regulated, and it's often exploited by criminality. And some of the unintended consequences are worth reflecting on. So the substitution of genuine product, I mean, this isn't a duty issue, but, you know, it's a counterfeit issue. So non-branded or counterfeit goods, the loss of product traceability and supply chain integrity. I think that's key in some of the conversation we've had just previously around those extended supply chains. We've got international cross-border movements, you know, there's movements between different markets, and that's an opportunity to disguise smuggling or diversion. We've got tax evasion, particularly in higher rate destination markets such as the UK. We've got something called trade-based money laundering. And trade-based money laundering is about under or overvaluing goods. Okay, so you start with a product, you bought it, it's got a value. You can undervalue it and you can overvalue it. And if you do that, you're moving money, you're essentially moving the proceeds of crime between different jurisdictions. And we do see that with some of the products in alcohol. We see particularly undervalued goods moving into the UK and potentially overvaluation of goods moving out of the UK. And that's about moving the money around as well as the goods. And we also see false deal change. So within that kind of grey market, you know, the creation of chains or sub-chains or kind of subcontract chains, and it provides cover for other criminality that's going on at the same time. Okay, so how do we tackle this? Well, one of the areas, much talked about area, and Graham mentioned it, is around due diligence. And so what are we talking about here? So at its very core, it's a governance process. It's aimed at reducing alcohol fraud, at least from HMRC's point of view, and it's all about supporting wider supply chain integrity. It's a condition of approval for registered businesses dealing in alcohol, and there's really extensive guidance available on gov.uk, and you'll receive have access to a copy of this presentation, so that the links are in there. That guidance does support businesses, and where we've got larger businesses in particular, we should always consider a written due diligence policy. It's for clarity, it's for consistency of treatment. It's not mandatory, but a written due diligence policy is often, you know, very useful in terms of making sure that employees, anybody in the business that's doing the work, is doing it well, doing it robustly. Considerations: identify the risks appropriate to your business. So not everything that I will have talked about today is appropriate to you and your business, but some of it may be. Okay, so those risks are appropriate. Focus time and resources on the highest risk. So I you know, sometimes we're not explicit about this, but it's worth doing due diligence, and it's worth spending time and resources and effort only on the highest risks. Okay, so where we've got a risk, that's where we'd like you to put your time and effort and resources. Tackling or trying to tackle every problem, you know, not necessarily the right way to go. Where we've got, for example, you've got a transnational entity, you've got cross-border movements, you've got high-strength beer, you've got risks around subcontract haulage. Those are the areas to focus on and spend time and resources there. Onboarding, always a critical assessment opportunity, you know, trying to understand what that business is trying to achieve, and whether they're, you know, it's genuine, or whether there's something that might raise concerns at that point. Saying that, criminals don't always tell the truth. You know, the reality is when we've looked at due diligence, we looked at what businesses have told other businesses about their supply chains, about their operating model. You know, a bit of testing and challenging of what you're told, just to be sure about it. is really important. And then use the information. So use it to inform those trading decisions. And if you feel like you're not comfortable, then it's not necessarily about not trading at all with a business, but it's about putting control measures in place to manage the potential risk. Risk can change over time, so refresh that due diligence frequently. And if you do identify risks and you are managing them, and that could be from a variety of ways, it could be through contractual arrangements, it could be through, supplying products only for certain markets, those kind of issues. If you're doing that and you're actively managing that, that's great. But if the controls are applied, then look out for potential displacement, look out for other things that business might be doing to circumvent those controls, and look out for other businesses that might be filling the gap that's been created. We're in the process, HMRC, of consulting trade representatives about the application of due diligence, and we would really welcome feedback on its application. Okay, so if you could put that through your trade body here, the BWA, that would be great. And it's something we do want to get right, both in terms of the guidance, what's out there, but also in the way that it's being applied. Really important that we do those things effectively, because it's a really critical control measure to manage the problem that we've got. Okay, so just thinking in very general terms, I've been scratching around or searching around for a helpful graphic for due diligence. I think this really sums it up. What we're looking for in terms of due diligence is quality. So, the information that's being provided, has it got a high level of accuracy? Is it authentic? Or is it accurate or lacking in detail? There's a judgment there. Is it trustworthy? Is what people are telling you right? And is it from people that you know and trust? Or is it from people you don't know or that you can't trust? Does it have value? Does it meet your needs and expectations? Is it what you asked? Okay, or has it got limited relevance, low practical value? And, are we using that to inform those decisions? It's helpful in thinking about those terms. You're not going to treat everybody consistently. You're going to have trusted business partners. You've got long-standing relationships with business. Those are the ones that you may take, more at face value than others that you might want to do that little bit more digging and that little bit more kind of research into the background of the company or what's being said. So that's due diligence. And then I've been talking with Graham and others and Clive about kind of what's the future hold. And this is really, it's not a consultation. It's not really kind of anything other than throwing a few ideas around and asking you, how do we get this? How do we make this better? How do we look to the future and kind of tackle some of these problems? And I think it's worth doing that. I think it's one of those areas where we constantly need to reflect on technology, our ability to do things in a more effective way. So in general, our systems for controlling alcohol, they're not always secure. We're acknowledging here that we've got fraud. There are supply chain issues. There are particular brands in our market. There's lots of opportunities for criminals to get involved, and they're getting access to our infrastructure, and they're circumventing the controls that we do put in. It's a bit of a kind of evolutionary arms race. We put in control somewhere, and they find another way in. We control that, and they find another way in. So it's a constant kind of battle. We respond, and we generally respond by treating the symptoms, not necessarily the cause. And if you said to me the cause is duty differential, well, I'm not sure whether we're going to ever deal with that. But there are causes to some of this in terms of what we do and how we do it that allows that criminal kind of intervention there. And I think we can think about doing some additional things to help treat that. We need a better and a more secure end-to-end process. That goes without saying. And the solution may already be out there. We just need to find it. And I think with the kind of conversation, we think about it in a number of different ways. So let's look to the future. What have we got? Have we got any of those smart products? How do we improve the goods themselves? How can we make them easier to identify as illicit? What technology is out there? How do we improve the traceability of alcohol and secure supply chains or movements? And we know we can do it. Certain sectors have very rigorous supply chain controls. Is there anything we can learn from those areas or that's already out there that can help us with alcohol? Do we need better legislation? Do we need to change or adapt what we're doing to make sure the proper taxes and duties are being paid? What controls have we got? What new capabilities or infrastructure do we need to tackle the fraud? And then a particular issue for me, and really important here, what partnerships and joint working arrangements are required to really maximise what we're doing? So those are kind of just open questions. They're out there. The caveat on that is, how do we all do it in a responsible and affordable way? Because this is the reality of the situation. We can't throw money at a problem unless we can see an obvious, clear solution to it. So that's the end of the presentation. Reflecting on the future, I think the way to end that, but hopefully you found that useful, and I've got an opportunity for questions now.
Thank you, Gary. I think that you're really insightful and useful, and supports our message that we're sending to our members around due diligence, but it's great. And hopefully the audience has found that really useful, and get some visibility around what this fraud looks like. So I'm hoping that that's the takeaway from this. Graham, have we got any questions pre-lodged to pose to Gary?
There's nothing in the chat yet, but I did send one to you earlier, Gary. I don't know if you've received that one.
Yes. This one was around potential changes to the WOWGA approvals process, or withdrawal of WOWGA approvals.
Yes.
This is an area where we're still in informal consultation on that, so there's no agreement or policy change. So but I think the question was around what happens if we remove WOWGA. How will a business be expected to manage the approved owners who come into their warehouses? They won't necessarily have access to all of the information HMRC has. And I think it's a good question, and it's one of those questions. So we sometimes complain that there's a lot of regulation, but some of those regulations are helpful in terms of managing risk, and actually the approvals process is probably one of those. It's an informal consultation. There's no agreement or policy change yet. We've had a kind of 5-week consultation process, ended in November, and we're reviewing the responses to that. And there have been different responses from different businesses, fair to say. If there will be any changes, you'll probably be the first to know. We'll communicate those changes immediately, but it's business as usual at the moment. So WOWGA is still there. We're still expecting, approved owners in warehouse only for certain commodities, and due diligence to be managed in the same way as it is currently.
Okay. Thanks,
Hopefully
Gary.
Answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Any questions from anybody? As Graham says, nothing in the chat, but happy for anybody to raise their hand, and we can maybe unmute you. Graham, can you unmute Brian?
Yep, I will do that.
Are you there, Brian?
Should be able to use that now, Brian.
Hello, Brian. Are you there?
You got me, great. Okay,
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Gary, for the presentation. It was me that raised the question about WOWGA, in as much as, what you've just explained here makes it very clear that fraud continues despite some people's views post-Brexit that it's gone away. My concern as a warehouse keeper and our members is WOWGA is an important part of our due diligence process, and customs can get some punchier questions out to the trader more than the warehouse keeper, and yet there is this consultation about removing it, along with potential for duty stamps on spirits. And I look at this and listen to this and think, are we putting the onus more back on the warehouse keeper at a time when duty fraud is still very much there? And the meetings I've attended through the JECG very much were leaning, from a customer's point of view, is very much leaning towards getting rid of both. That seemed to be the favoured approach, which I'm totally against, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a balance, Brian, and and this is a kind of a politician's answer. There's a balance between facilitating trade, making things easier for businesses, and managing risks. And I'm with you on the question of fraud still being out there, definitely. Yeah. WOWGA is we have WOWGA in the UK. It was introduced in 1999. It's been helpful in managing risks. Is it perfect? Does it manage all of the risks that we've got? The answer is no to both of those questions. But do we want to do away with it? That is a really big kind of change, a sea change, and would require quite considerable, change in the approach, particularly for warehouse keepers, obviously. Now, as I say, the consultation is ongoing with that. We're reviewing the responses, and I don't have an answer to it, and I'm sorry to say that. There are lots of people within HMRC that recognise that doing something like that is a dramatic change and potentially increases the risk. Putting the onus onto warehouse keepers, there will be an onus around the due diligence side of that. You've got to have the tools to be able to do due diligence properly. That's the critical thing for me. If you haven't got those tools, then you can't do it. It's got to be reasonable and proportionate. But if we change the legislation, if we make a change fundamentally to the control regime, then we've got to put measures in place that will help you manage that risk as effectively, hopefully, as we have done in the past. Thank you for the question. It's well articulated, and it goes to the heart of the issue.
I think one thing, Gary, you just said there, I think, your presentation is clear that the post-Brexit and then the position with Ireland, North and South, there's been a real upturn in fraud as part of the route supply, which, as we know, over the years has happened. And again, I look at this and think to myself, why take away a level of control that's in place and supports the warehouse keeper?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I hear what you're saying, Brian. I've sent your question on to the right people to make sure that that lands as well as it can. Two sides to that there are others that are pushing very hard for WOWGA to be removed. That yourself, and as I say, it's a balance. We it's up to the minister ultimately, to decide, and that's kind of throwing it outside HMRC, which I'm not kind of dodge the question, but I don't have control over that myself. No. I personally, I don't think it's the right way to go, but that isn't necessarily my decision.
Yeah, okay.
With regard to the kind of the question about fraud at the moment, and the movements there, you'll have seen over the years, because you'll have attended presentations previously. There are elements of the fraud that have changed. So we used to talk about multiple movements or multiple mirror loads in relation to individual movements. So that has changed. So we've had, some of the problem has changed. It's evolved. It's moved in a different way. It's not gone away. Okay, but the tax gap numbers, they have gone in the right direction. As I said, the very blunt instrument, but it is, so there is some, the general thread is we are doing better. We are making progress here. The timing of removing some of these controls, because ultimately, if we had resolved alcohol fraud and it wasn't there, I don't think there's any need for any controls in the process. But that's something that's not going to happen. Not going to happen for some time, I don't think. But we have to balance when those things, are best to be implemented.
Yeah. Gary, a question from me around the sharing of information. And I know this is something we've spoken about before, and has been a topic of conversation for many years. But is there any change, coming from HMRC about the willingness to share information about some of these organised crime kind of supply chains or individuals? Because that from a member's perspective and a warehouse keeper's perspective, getting yeah, this has been great in terms of, well, what does the current kind of alcohol fraud supply chains look like? But is there any change in view that HMRC can share some of the more shared information they've previously not wanted to share around some of these fraudsters?
The answer to that is yes. We're trying to share what we can. We're governed by, restrictions in terms of sharing customer information. I can't share information about you. I wouldn't want HMRC to share information about me, and that applies whether or not we think there's a kind of a criminal problem or there's an illicit supply chain here. Where we can share information and it's right, where there's a benefit in doing it and a very clear benefit, we do it. And just yesterday, I spoke to one of the big producers, and I shared some very specific information about both the business, a number of supply chains, our seizures, our kind of, some of the data that we've got on international movements, because that business needs to know it in order to manage a particular risk properly. And without that information, it's a bit like this presentation. It's not specific to you. It doesn't give you an actual tangible name or any particular brands to look at. But with that particular producer, I could be much more specific. And I think with some individual businesses, and I include some of the logistics providers, warehouses, we have done that. We have tried to share as much as we reasonably can in order to help manage the risk, and we will continue to do that. But it's one of those. It's a difficult area for us because of the legislation. Not an excuse, but you become personally liable if you make a disclosure. So the disclosure I made yesterday, I'm personally liable for that if it's been made in a way that is inappropriate, or I've shared information that I shouldn't have shared. So once again, we've got a balance here, but we do this in circumstances where there is a benefit both to HMRC and to the business themselves.
Okay, thank you. Graham, are there any questions raised in the chat?
Yeah, we've got a couple here. So Michelle Sloan from RPC has asked, has HMRC opened any facilitation of tax evasion investigations in this area?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. I mean, in terms of the work that we do more generally, we have a pipeline of casework. We've got opportunities to look at both our civil and criminal prosecution options, recovering money, and we do that. But I couldn't talk about specifics in this area.
Okay, thank you. And there's one from Ronnie, and he's Ronnie Reed is just asking, can Gary comment on the Safe Sellers v HMRC case, which appears to be the legal ruling in which HMRC are going to hold warehouse keepers responsible for due diligence?
Okay, so some of the criminal legislation that we have is built on kind of decisions at tribunals. I think Safe Sellers is one of those. I can't comment in relation to the specific case. There was an awful lot of information there, but I think the issue is clear that businesses, where there is information, where there are indicators of fraud, need to be very careful about getting involved in supply chains or getting involved in activity where there are clear indicators. That's all I would say. I mean, due diligence needs to be reasonable, needs to be proportionate, needs to be focused on the highest risks, as I said. But I can't really comment in relation to that. There was a lot of that content. Perhaps if it could be more specific, I'd be very happy to comment on more specific question.
Okay, Graham, any more questions?
Nothing else at the moment. But if anyone does have any questions, we can certainly take them after following the session and talk to Gary about them.
Okay, well, yeah. All I can say is, look, thank you very much for the opportunity today. Really important that HMRC talks to businesses, tries to share as much as we can in terms of our information and insights. It's been a great opportunity, and thank you for everybody who's attended.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Appreciate you joining us today. And just to echo what Graham says, if anybody does have any further questions or think of any further questions, please send those to Graham, and then we can then share those and pass those on to Gary. But thanks again. I mean, we've had a great attendance today, 80 plus at times. So thank you for your time, and have a great weekend, and speak to you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.